Welcome everyone. Before we start off with the content of the presentation, I will introduce ourselves first. So first of all, Moana, you may want to introduce yourself.
Yes, absolutely. Kia ora e te whānau, ko karangi toku maunga, ko waikato toku awa, ko purereriki toku marae, ko Ngāti Mahuta, ko Ngāti Maniapoto, ko Waikato toku iwi, ko Uerata toku ingo whānau, ko Tainui toku waka, ko ki te kāhui mā te puka puka ahau e mahi ana, ko Moana ahau. Nō reira, i ngā rangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm Moana Uerata-Jennings. I'm the manager of the manager volunteering at the Cancer Society Wellington Division. I've been in this role for nearly 2 years, and prior to that I worked for the Royal New Zealand Plunket Trust as their community services leader for 10 years.
Tēnā koutou katoa, I whānau mei aho I horana, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu e nehe o petoni e noho ne o, ko ebing toko ingwa whānau, ke te kāhui matapuku o Aotearoa aho e mahi ana, ko taku ingwa ko Helga, no reira, kia ora tātou katoa. I'm Helga Wientjes. I work for the Cancer Society of New Zealand, the National Office, and I work with Moana and 5 other volunteering leaders across the country, which is a real privilege. I've been working for the Cancer Society for 7 years, so I've been around for a little while. And in my volunteer job, I chaired Volunteering New Zealand, so you have probably seen me in that capacity possibly as well. But today it's all about an experience that we had as the Cancer Society. So we will bring up the PowerPoint and we will share that. Wow, no, that's too soon.
Oh, sorry.
I'll share the screen and then hopefully we can get that sorted. Right. So I will first start with setting the scene. So the Cancer Society of New Zealand was invited by the American Cancer Society to attend a conference. And that was so because we are one of the 30 global partners of the American Cancer Society. So there are 30 plus cancer organizations around the globe, all working towards a similar mission. The reason why Moana and I went to this particular conference is because of the focus of volunteer engagement. And the title of the conference was Empower Volunteers, Expand Impact. So we will today share a few things that we learned. Some of it may be really new to you, some will be like old knowledge, but it was some of the things that stood out for us and how we have implemented that in our organization. And hopefully that will also spark you to think about what you can do for your organization. So in this presentation, we will first start off with talking about the 2 streams in the conference. So one was around Relay for Life, which is a program that Moana will tell a little bit more about in detail. And the other stream was the so-called CAN, which is the Cancer Action Network, and I will cover that in a bit more detail. So we tell about them, and then we will zoom out and tell you about what they have in common at an operational program level, but also at a cultural organizational level. Throughout the presentation, we will try to include tangible examples of what it all means that you can translate to your organization. And of course, in the end, we will hopefully have some time for some questions.
Awesome. Okay, so first I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of Relay for Life. So Relay for Life was started in 1985, as you can see from the table that's up at the moment. And it came to New Zealand in 2001. Relay for Life is the biggest peer-to-peer fundraiser in the world. And it's for One Hope, One World, One Hope. So communities as far as Soweto, South Africa, and Fukushima in Japan are coming together in the fight against cancer. So as Helga said, it runs in 30 countries, including countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It's a community-based event, so Relay for Life is the face of the Cancer Society organisations in the communities, but it's also a portal to our organisation. The event is run to celebrate survivors, remember loved ones, and fight back against cancer. And when you participate in a Relay for Life event, you become a vital part of the Cancer Society. So you become part of 2 million odd people, 2.5 million actually, of survivors, patients, advocates and researchers and volunteers, caregivers, etc. And if you have a look at the table here, it just gives you a little bit more information of the idea of the scale of Relay for Life. So you can see that there's 973 events run globally, approximately 418,000 participants, and they generate $233 million US. So a pretty big event for us across the globe.
Yeah. And that is just to add to that, the 2018 figures. So this is done on a yearly basis, so the reach is quite significant.
So Relay for Life is community owned. It's volunteer led and staff supported. So the wee image on the left hand side there that says event leadership team and community development manager is an example of volunteer led staff supported model. So the volunteers are the leadership team, the event leadership team, and the community development manager is the staff support, or the staff partner as it was termed over in America. And what does that mean? It means meaningful partnerships to positively impact the mission. So that's between the volunteer to staff member and volunteer to volunteer. Volunteer engagement means taking the handcuffs off, empowering them and trusting them to do a good job. And you do that through providing leadership, development, working in collaboration, and recognising them. So why do we do this? It expands our reach and our impact into the community. It's by community for community. The community is way more responsive, as you all know, when when community members are involved in each of those organisations, and it increases capacity and the capability of the organisation. We've just had a wee moment, a technical glitch there, so now we're back to it. And I'm just going to pass over to Helga in terms of grassroots advocacy.
Yeah, just before I do that, sorry, I need to check if the power is now on. Yes, just want to make sure that we can continue running this presentation. Sorry for that little glitch. Yeah. Oh no. Right. Not working. Oh,
hello.
Hello. There we are. Right. Well, this is a picture of Moana in right of the center of Washington, D.C. with some other fellow global partners from other countries, in this case, Ireland and the UK, and a person also from Illinois. Yeah. So the other stream was all around grassroots advocacy. So the Cancer Society, the American Cancer Society, have set up a separate organization. It's called the Cancer Action Network. The reason why they set up a separate organization is to do with their charity law, and they're really strict in whether or not you can advocate as a charity. And so they didn't want to jeopardize the charity status as the American Cancer Society, so they had to set up another arm. Luckily, we can do some advocacy in New Zealand, and hopefully with the new charity law legislation coming in, that is even going to be better. I often use the word CAN and American Cancer Society kind of simultaneously, because basically, in essence, it's part of the same mission and same organization. So the tagline of the Cancer Action Network is Power of the People. So they have about 500,000 people in their database. And these people are people who care and want to see policy change. Research that the Cancer Action Network has conducted shows that personal stories really motivate lawmakers. And therefore, they have taken a few actions. So they actively recruit ambassadors and action takers from within communities. And they give these volunteers a sense of their own power. So they are actually involved in this whole decision making at a state and at the whole of America level. They use a multi-channeled approach, so they both do online and offline activities, and they really coach and mentor their volunteers. So recently in New Zealand, we had our own example in the cancer space of the power of the people. So the Cancer Society had been advocating for a national cancer agency for quite some time, basically behind the scenes, working with policymakers, etc., etc. And we made some traction, but not really. And mining, you probably have all heard of this person, was one of the speakers there, and he was really advocating for this cancer network, a national organization. And so within 6 months, there was a commitment from the government to set up this agency. And only last week, it was announced that the agency is up and running. So it's, within a year that this has been achieved, which is huge. And we would not have got to this place without a person like Blair, who has really been able to motivate and get to the hearts of a lot of New Zealanders. And therefore policymakers were listening and realizing that they needed to do something. So that was absolutely fantastic. So we know that that model, what the American Cancer Society is doing, really works in New Zealand, because we had this great example. And I'm sure that you all, from your own organizations and your own missions and purposes, you will have similar stories to share as well. So within the Cancer Action Network, they operate within 3 different tiers. So the bottom tier is the troops, they call them. And those are the 500,000 volunteers in their database. And they are involved in small actions. So this might be signing a petition or printing out a pre-written letter to a local MP that they might sign. Well, obviously they don't have local MPs as we do, but you can understand the equivalent. So they're all really small actions that are really low touch for these people. But actually, if you all combine these small touches, it will actually make a really a difference. Then the second tier are the so-called ambassadors. So within each of the states, they have a small group of people who really stepped up and have some more time available and really want to actively be involved in this policy change. So these people, there's approximately over 500, are really the heart of the organization. And those people actually attended the conference that we were attending as well. So the conference was basically organized around these people, and we were just participants, basically observers of this whole program. So the local state representatives and define what is important to their own state, as well as working on national initiatives. And then they have the top tier. So people with Moana and info, or just have a really wide reach. And there are, of course, only a few people of those involved in that. It's really easy to become involved, and they have these different levels. So people can just choose where they're at, how they want to become involved. And that is really easy. And another thing is that the volunteers are really well supported by staff. It's interesting to see how they organize themselves with everything they do. So they have per state probably 1 staff member. Some of the bigger states, they might have 2 or 3 staff members, if they're really large. But in essence, I teamed up with Rhode Island. There was only 1 staff member. So it's interesting that those people are actually they are supporting a wide group of volunteers. So their role is not so much doing the work, it's supporting the volunteers for them to do the work. So that's basically the model. And they hold monthly teleconferences with these volunteers, yearly trainings, and also this conference. I think I saw some comments coming through to the chat, so I'll see if I can pop that up. Oh, that was not what I intended. It's not wanting to do what I... the chat box doesn't appear, which is annoying, so I can't really look at that. So I'll finish my little blurb about this, stop sharing, and then have a quick look at the chats, if that's all right with you guys, because otherwise we lose our flow. So the ambassadors are all recognized to be experts in their own story. So they come in, and the whole purpose is, of course, to tell their personal story, and then the American Cancer Society backs that up with facts and research and science and so on to make sure that that message is coherent. And in their training, they really focus on how the volunteer can link their personal story to the policy ask that the organization is making. Because of all of this, the Cancer Action Network is the leading cancer patient voice in the United States. And it's because of the volunteers. A really good benefit of it is that their volunteers cover all backgrounds, all areas, urban, rural, ethnicities, you know, the whole thing. And also the voices and ideas and experiences are, you know, very wide-ranging. So the American Cancer Society is therefore trusted as a really good cancer patient voice. It's really fascinating how, as an organization, they talk about the volunteers and how they talk to the volunteers. So at the opening address, the chief executive of the Cancer Action Network said the following: "We honor the people who passed on by getting off our butts and change the world. Together we can make a difference for millions of people. Never underestimate your power. You ensure we are in all communities. You are our representatives. You are getting to the heart, to the head through the heart." So it's just really inspirational to hear right from the top level of the organization to everybody else involved, how raving they are about the volunteers and how they absolutely acknowledge that they could not do the work without the volunteers. I promised to stop sharing and quickly look at the chat. So, right, whew, it's quite a few questions. The sound keeps cutting out. Sorry, I can't really do anything about that. I did hear that the connection was a little bit unstable, so hopefully that is getting better. The third tier of the three tiers were the influencers. So they could be, in this particular case, chief executives of big organizations, so a local hospital, for example. It could be other people with a lot of standing in the community, people who are respected by the local community and by other organizations as having a good voice, whilst they are also independent, having their own role. They are volunteering for the Cancer Society, adding to that basically voice of the troops. I hope that explains it. Yeah, so we will just make sure that every now and then we will go back to the chat so we can cover those questions and make sure that you can hear the whole story. So I will go back to sharing mode now. And continue on. Right. So it's a strategic decision to approach advocacy through grassroots engagement. And the American Cancer Society really trusts the volunteers that they can play that role. And just to give you an idea of this particular event, so the conference was there for training. We would touch on that in a little bit more detail. But there were 588 volunteers all coming together, representing all the states. They came from all areas, urban, rural communities. And on the so-called lobby day, so that's the day after the conference day, where all the volunteers go into Capitol Hill, 493 meetings were held concurrently. So all the different volunteers were meeting with senators and representatives of the state all in one day, 493 meetings. It was an absolute mind-blowing experience to be part of that. And you can see from the uniforms, Capitol Hill was light blue, and there were volunteers and staff everywhere, which was pretty awesome. Now I'm lost in my notes. Fantastic. Oh, that was the story about the Capitol. Oh, that was at the end of the day. Sorry, I should have shown you this picture when I was talking about strategic decision. We will refer to this later in more detail. So basically, we now covered the two different streams, so the Relay for Life stream and the Cancer Action Network, what they are about, how they engage volunteers with that. So now we will focus on what these two streams or programs actually have in common. So I said just before, in regards to the Cancer Action Network, that it is a strategic decision to engage grassroots in advocacy, and it's as well a strategic decision to engage communities through Relay for Life. So that, of course, is a starting point. If you say that, that requires, of course, commitment and investment. So it needs to be embedded in your strategic plan, in your business planning, in your budgets, and in documents such as standards of engagement of volunteers, if you have them. So you need to make sure that that kind of structural framework is there to actually drive that. Then you will go on your goal setting on a program level. So what one you want to achieve this particular round, or what one you want to achieve basically as a goal for the program in itself. After you've done that, you set up your systems, and that requires a really systematic approach. Obviously, it requires resourcing. If you don't have any money to support that, then it's getting so much harder. And it's really not hard as long as you have the investment and you can understand it really well, I suppose, from your own organization. With setting up systems, you also need to think about your process that you put in place. So what the American Cancer Society did for the Cancer Action Network, for example, they engaged a company called Soapbox. They do a lot of advocacy through the People's Voice. So there are actually even companies who assist with that. So they have an app. So all the volunteers would download the app on their phones and that they could manage basically the whole day through the app. So that's all part of setting up your systems to enable that. That really tight schedules, you can imagine for the 493 meetings, you really need to plan that out well, because a volunteer cannot be at the same place twice. So they had really tight schedules, they had really made clear where a particular policymaker was at. So for example, if they were supportive of one policy ask, or if they were still a little bit dubious about something else. So the volunteers came in really well prepared to talk about those points. But all that preparation and setting up systems need to be done in advance. The app also enabled for a feedback loop that is really important, and we touch on that further. So once you've set up all these systems, then you go on further on preparing. And with preparing comes attention to detail. And we have some really good examples of how well the American Cancer Society actually is able to go right into detail. Now just go back to that previous picture, because Moana has a good example to share.
So for the layout of this, so this is the reflecting pool in Washington, DC, and there's approximately 43,000 candle bags, or as we call them in New Zealand, or lights of hope for their terminology, and to put them all up there took quite a long time, and it was a very precise military operation managed by volunteers. So people checked in, and they went to the information booth, they checked in, they got a bottle of water and a sun hat, and directions to which tent they were allocated depending on how far each group had got. So each one of the flags that you can see is representing a different state, and they had 3 rows on each side of the reflecting pool. So if you align that with a person, that's an awful lot of people and to try and get that message across. So it was quite an impactful thing. So the volunteers then would be allocated to their tent. They would help to put the sand in the bags, the candles in the bags, and the attention to detail was so precise that they had how much you could fill each one up to, and that was so that you could make sure that all the bags were covered. And then they went on the trolley and out they went. And if you weren't going fast enough, you got told you weren't going fast enough. So it was really a military operation. And then quick as that, at the end of the ceremony, overnight, it all had come back, and they'd cleaned the place up as well. So very, very precise, and they had it all run very, very well. Another example was that when we went into Capitol Hill, as part of the conference pack, we were all given metro tickets. Now, my assumption going over to the States is that everyone knew what the metro was. except me. But no, so many states, many people from different places had no idea what the Metro was and how to use it or navigate it. So they gave you the cards, and there was a staff partner next to the machines to show you how to top up your card and which trains to get on, and where, which stops to get off. So that's where the staff partners were, to make sure that all the volunteers could get to their 493 meetings in that day. So yeah, just an example of how much detail they went to in ensuring volunteers got to where they needed to go.
Yeah. And with the Cancer Action Network also, so at the end of each meeting, one of the processes is that they would then send a thank you card to the person they've just spoken to, just to thank them for the time, and maybe if they have committed to a particular policy ask, thanking them for that as well. So we had an envelope with some cards shoved into it, but not only that, there was of course an instruction that really spelled out what was required to put on the card, what type of messages you could put on that, how to address the card to absolutely make sure that it would arrive in the right spot. So those 3 examples really show that the American Cancer Society really thinks through every single aspect so that the volunteers are set up for success. All the information is there, there's no doubt at one point whatsoever, oh, what am I supposed to do next? Everything is just really, really clear. So whatever the volunteers are doing, their time is just put straight into the effort that is required. They have a great experience. There's no doubt whatsoever in what they're supposed to do. Of course, these examples are quite detailed about labory tasks, but it is more just to illustrate that the whole point of setting your volunteers up for success. What is also interesting is with that, the preparation and setting up the systems was also the thinking about how they come across. So the volunteers and the staff partners both had the same uniform on, so the same shirts, the same jackets and so on. So they all look professional, and you could not see the difference between volunteers and staff. So long story short, you can imagine that those events take a lot of time to prepare. They make sure that all the information is there for the volunteers about what to do, but also around the policy asks. So for example, the conference, before you arrived on the conference, all the participants had received a lot of detailed information about the 4 policy asks of that year. So all the research, the reasons why the Cancer Society was going for those 4 points, basically their position statements. So the volunteers could read that in advance. Then they would come to the conference, and that information was repeated by different people. So researchers would come to stage and really share that information. And what I really sensed from that is they really value the professional development of the volunteers. They really give that wider context of the organization and why people do things, and give them all that kind of information that you understand why you want to make that change. And then the last part of the conference was basically going back in your own state groups. And then they would practice. Again, leaving nothing to chance. So they would do role plays. One person would be the senator, the other one would be the volunteer, and they would just practice these asks and getting them comfortable in doing that. So yeah, it's just mind blowing to see to what level of detail that is done. Then of course the execution. Yeah, and in that space, again, they really make sure that they bring the volunteers up to the next level wherever they are. So you had a really good example of that, didn't you, Moana?
Absolutely. So I walked alongside the Illinois team, who is one of the most proactive states over there. And so I met a lovely lady by the name of Catherine. And Catherine was exceptionally nervous. It was her first lobby day experience. She was prepared as much as she could be, but she was very nervous about talking in front of a senator, as I would have been. And what happened was that they had someone who was more experienced would start off the process so she could see the full process happen. Then the next meeting that they had might have been with a House of Representatives person, and she would talk to one of the asks. So normally a person would do one of each, they would split it up between all 4 people, and one ask would be done per person. So then they got her to try that, and then by the last meeting, she was doing the whole thing on her own and adding a whole lot of extra conversation and then tying it into her personal story. So throughout that whole entire day, you could see that confidence level grow in her, and it was really mind-blowing to watch, because it was volunteers mentoring volunteers, and the staff partner was there, but it was the volunteers that were sort of helping to develop each other. So it was really, really quite cool to see.
And then they also spend a lot of time in providing feedback. So they could provide feedback through the app, that they downloaded. They also had to fill out reports, etc., the thank you cards, etc., etc. They also posted stuff live on Facebook, hashtagging, trending, of course, on the day. But that information is and really being used, the effectiveness of them. And that information again is fed back to the volunteers. So they both received, and I see the connection is unstable, so jump in if you can't hear it. So they received 2 reports. One was with a program evaluation, so how well it was set up and anything that could be improved around that. And they of course get that feedback from the volunteers, and then they feed it back to the volunteers what changes they are going to make based on that feedback. And another important report was, of course, the effectiveness of their work. So they, again, demonstrating what all their time investment actually resulted into. And of course, we all know that it is really important for recognition and engagement and retention to make sure that you highlight the impact and the outcome of the work that the volunteer is doing. I feel.
So I'm going to talk about the second commonality, which is culture, so culture of your organisation. And this photo here is really an example of, can you tell the difference between a paid staff member and a volunteer? So the American Cancer Society is a volunteer-led organisation, staff supported, and volunteers are the heart and soul of the community and the organisation, and they're critical to success at every level of the organisation. So volunteers are involved in every component, and that's right from strategic planning right through to the grassroots level. So they are everywhere, and success is built on the relationships between the volunteers and paid staff, and volunteers to volunteers. And so as a volunteer coordinator or volunteer manager, you'd know that success is built on relationships between your volunteers and staff, and the stronger the relationship you have, the easier it is to work with a volunteer, and they'll be more willing to try new things. If you were to ask them to try a new role, they'd probably be more willing because of your relationship with them. You might see a potential in a volunteer and want to harness that, and then willing to give it a go. So it's around having that relationship so that you can have those conversations. And so that's something that we witness quite a lot through the American Cancer Society as well. They talk a lot about staff partnerships. So employees are called staff partners as opposed to just paid staff, and they're actively looking for opportunities to engage volunteers in a meaningful way. So this is quite meaningful, and they tag it back to their story. A volunteer that I met, she had a story and she didn't think that it was relevant to being part of the organisation, but once the organisation had trained her and actually talked to her about that, she was quite overwhelmed that she could actually make a difference. So it was really quite exciting for her, and hence she stayed for quite some time. And so this culture is quite palatable. It was mind-blowing for myself to watch it in action. It's something that we all talk about. It's something that we all strive to do. And this was an example of us actually being in amongst something that's working. So you can see and experience how the volunteers and paid staff work together through every single interaction, right from CE level right down to grassroots.
Yeah, and this is actually not what we practice, but a few years ago, I also was able to go to a conference from the American Cancer Society, and that was solely focused on Relay for Life. There were over 1,000 participants at the conference, and at no point in time was there a staff partner or a paid staff member on stage. Every single session was led by a volunteer, and the staff were only working in the background. And so it's just so incredible to see such a professional organized conference. And you know that, of course, we all know that volunteers are absolutely capable to do anything with the right support, because they bring skills and experience to our organizations. But the American Cancer Society somehow really can unleash that and harness that and use it for their own benefit, basically. Yeah,
absolutely. And one of the examples they also had in the conference pack, something that we would, have as a normal standard example, is a reimbursement form. So reimbursement, if you have a paid staff member that incurs costs during a conference, so too does a volunteer. So there's no difference in any of that. And the expectation is that they would put that in there. They're able to claim. Whether a volunteer claims or not is a different story, but the organisation has set that expectation that both volunteers and paid staff can claim that reimbursement. So it's really nice to see that there's no difference between the two.
Yeah.
And so for volunteer engagement, moving on to this lovely slide, to be successful, any paid role within your organisation, working with volunteers, needs to have strong relationship management skills. It needs to come from right at the beginning, right through to everyday work. So an example we had, an Ask the Volunteer panel, which consisted of a student, a new mum, and a grandmother. We asked them why they chose to volunteer, given that they have time, they were time poor, time constraints, yet they were at this conference every year. They were doing extra things. They were quite out there in terms of wanting to support the American Cancer Society. And what it came down to was clear expectations of the role and realistic timing. So not saying it takes an hour and actually takes 3. They want it to be meaningful. Is it going to make a difference? And they like to be asked. And all of us know that shoulder tapping is the easiest way to get people on board, but it is about someone being asked. It's also good for professional development for them and for the organisation. So you invest in your volunteers, and we'll show you an example of that later on. You invest in your volunteers, and volunteers will invest time for you and your organisation. And that's the same things that you would do for staff. So there's no difference in that respect. The ability to trust that a volunteer will do a good job as well as a paid staff member, that is something that is very tricky in most organisations. You may not get it right with a paid staff member. You may not get it right with a volunteer. But if you put your checks and balances in the way in which you recruit, then there should be no, it would be a risk that you would probably be, there wouldn't be any risk involved. And the strong expectation that all staff within your organisation are to work with volunteers. So you might have a diverse team, it might be IT, it might be admin, but the expectation that right from the top right down to everyone in between, there is an expectation that they will work with volunteers and they must understand how to do that. And it's acknowledged right from the role, the ad that goes out to the newspapers, or now online, role descriptions, it's featured right through role descriptions, questions in the interviews around working with volunteers, and then ongoing professional development through the organisation. And that's for paid staff and volunteers to work together. And then communication, also feedback. So Helga talked just recently about the 2 mechanisms for the CAN track, so the Cancer Action Network, where they fed back the difference that the volunteers had made within those 2 big reports. And that's what they're wanting. They want to know, is it making a difference? It's also checking in to see how they're going. Are they still enjoying their volunteering experience? But it's that regular follow-up that they really, really like, and just regular check-ins goes a long way to keep their engagement level up. Again, the stronger the relationship that you have, the easier it is to give and receive feedback as well. So, yeah. Awesome. Now this funky little picture. So the things that we have actually taken on board, or things that we are doing within our organisation in an effort to increase the positive culture and working with volunteers, is that we're developing training for paid staff to work effectively with volunteers at the moment. So that's ongoing right now. We're looking to change the language, and that's the key messages, both internal and external. So it's a very important change for culture. So it's not around volunteers and paid staff, it's actually working together, so a partnership. The role descriptions we have don't have the word volunteer contained in them. We've been very deliberate to enhance the manner of a volunteer, and volunteer refers to the pay status rather than the role itself. So we've made a point of making sure it's the actual role title and not the word volunteer.
So we, for example, we would say they're a receptionist and it is a volunteer position, or we would say they're a client driver and it's a volunteer position. So we really highlight the things that they are doing and the difference they are making. Of course, not forgetting that they are volunteer, because that's recognizing that in itself is really good, but the work that they're doing is still described as the work that they're contributing, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Staff partners, using the term staff partners, so working alongside volunteers. Volunteers are featuring in our new strategic plan, so they're embedded right through the plan. And we recently had a staff training day in Wellington focusing on volunteering. So it was there to increase the confidence to work with volunteers. And what was really heartening to see by the end of the training was that some staff were already starting to use the word staff partners. So they must have got some of those messages, which is absolutely fantastic. So it was really nice to see they could see where that actually was relevant to them. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we invest a lot in the training of the volunteers, but we more and more start to also invest in the training of our paid staff to work effectively with volunteers, just to make sure we harness that. So the last thing we have for you is a short video of this person. She's called Caitlin, and they call them even high-level volunteers in the American Cancer Society. And she tells about how she got involved in the Cancer Society, and that might be really, hopefully inspiring. We found it really inspiring. Wanted to highlight that the way she finished off her off-the-cuff chat, basically, because we asked her, how did you become involved? And she was standing there, was just camera pointed at her. It's not practice, but it just shows the confidence that they have and the support that they have given this person to really own this place. But she finishes off with the mission of the organization, and she does that so naturally. So you know that this person is an ambassador for life for the organization. She's so passionate about it. And that's so, yeah, it's really goosebumpy, I find, to see. But before we do that, I really would like to know if there are any particular questions. So I'll stop sharing so we can bring up that chat again. And fire away your questions. Just didn't give you a lot of time to think about it, but let's just wait and see if anything comes through. I only see that there's issues with the connection, but hopefully you're still all there.
Well, maybe if we play Caitlin's
yeah, that might be a good way.
Video, it might give people
oh, you had a great line. Tanya says, you had a great line about highlighting the impact and ... What was the rest? Whew.
well.
This is one of those things. Then you start chatting. Was that, in what context was that, basically? Tanya, if you can write that. In the meantime, we'll go to Michelle Reddy's question. How do you assign appropriate tasks for volunteers depending on their skills? Do you have something to say about that?
I guess it's through a lot of conversation through your interview process. Basically what happened, what we do is we 9 times out of 10 get them to come in based on a role that they think that they're applying for, and actually you find that they're probably suited to some other roles. And so we actually try and give them a little bit of an opportunity to have a look at some other roles that we think they might be suited for. And you know, you're always looking for certain personalities. You're also looking for certain, whether they have the right level of empathy. For us in the cancer world, we have to make sure that these people are resilient. So there's a whole lot of things that we need to look at, and you can only really determine that by having those conversations. So I think a lot of it is actually drawn out from when you interview a person, and then you can actually see where they're suited to.
Yeah, and then also it's probably about having that relationship, so knowing what the person's interest is and asking you to do something else. And Caitlin actually explains that really well. So she's not necessarily asked for roles, but also just tasks to do. It's like, hey, would you like to be involved in this project? It sounds actually really interesting, then you might be interested in that. So it's just asking that sort of experience. So it's about making sure that you start with that relationship, but of course you need to build it first. James suggested that your question, Tanya, was around the reporting. I remember saying something about the outcome reporting, that we said the impact and the outcome. But what I will do, because we have recorded this, I will re-listen to this as well and make sure that we can quote that particular question. How about that? By the way, you can all also re-look at this and share this later on with friends if you want to, because it will be on the VNZ website. Yeah, so Michelle, great. You have a question around the standards of engagement. So the Cancer Society has had our standards of engagement with volunteers in place for over 30 years. So it's actually pretty awesome that we have them so long. They have, of course, evolved quite a bit over time. So there are standards that we set ourselves as an organization, how we want to engage with volunteers, what practices do we want to see. So for example, one of the standards is that we will reimburse volunteers for agreed out of pocket expenses. We have this expectation that paid staff and volunteers work in partnership. There's a whole bunch of standards that we have defined ourselves. It's signed off by our chief executive committee, so it has been kind of that commitment from the top. And what we as leaders now need to make sure is constantly making sure that new staff, especially paid staff, are familiar with these standards and operating according to them. In the past, we handed them out to the volunteers, but we decided to no longer do that because the volunteers should actually experience us living up to our standards rather than reading about them. So yeah, so that's one thing that we do. Feel free to email us if you want to see a copy, because we are all for sharing. Kat says something about responsibility is important, but wary of putting too much pressure on the volunteers. Really good question.
That really all comes down to your processes and policies. So, you know, as we talked about earlier, volunteers want to know clear expectations of the role. And then they can talk to you about that. So if there is too much, if they feel it's too much pressure, then they can have a conversation with you about that. Really, you need to be mindful when you're thinking about those roles that it's not too big. It's not something that you wouldn't put a paid staff member into. So really just thinking about all those things. I would say you have a proper job description for a volunteer, and a lot of the time that's how they like to work. Some are very relaxed and not wanting to have all of that sort of kerfuffle, but for a lot of people it keeps them safe. So they know what's expected of them, they know where to go to get help, they know who's looking after them. So I think when they've got those processes and boundaries, it actually makes the roles a little bit easier to function.
Yeah. And also be mindful that not everyone wants to be engaged, of course, to the same level. So again, it is about those people who seem eager and seem to want to go to the next step. So with the Cancer Action Network, what I said is 500,000 people who just do really light touch, you know, once a month. It could be a really small thing. And there are 500, and that's across the whole United States, that are the ambassadors that go to really hard out level. So it's not so that everybody engaged in your organization needs to commit the same amount of time. It's all about flexibility and finding what works for the different volunteers, and being able to dice it up. So you have jobs for people to do that are really wanting to go light touch, just want to come in and out, and that's it. And then you also are able to work with those who want to go to that next step. So and that differs from persons to person. I once read a really good book. It's called The New Breed. It's all about the modern volunteer. And this author said also about, don't ask me to marry you on my first date. So sometimes we try to recruit people for really big jobs, and they don't even know if they like us, right? So if you engage them for something small, so you go on the first date, you can test each other out and build that relationship before you go full blown in asking them to marry you. So that's just a really nice analogy that we can also sometimes apply.
Yes. We have one question from Nicola.
I'm really dry, so you need to answer.
So it says, hey ladies, just wondering what volunteers think about the new wording staff partners. Have you had any feedback about how it makes them feel? I guess we started that in our training just recently, and volunteers were in that particular training day because they presented around what they do. And I think they felt quite chuffed about it. I think it's sort of, they felt more part of the team. They want to feel part of the team. They want to know who all the staff are. If new people are starting, they want to know who those people are. They want to feel connected. Now, you're never going to get it right in getting all the staff members and all volunteers to know who's who. But we're really trying to make a point of making sure we learn people's names. We have 60, 70 odd volunteers walking through our doors every day. So I'm just making sure that people actually make a point of learning their names and making sure they say good morning. Just those little touches, I think, is really big on engagement. So I'll let you know how that goes. It's just a work in progress at the moment, but so far so good.
But I really like, and that's why we had the photo of the dog with the thing, because it was all about communicating in messages and what do you want to hear. So I really think choosing your words well helps you creating the culture you want. So if you start using the word partnerships, it really demonstrates straight away, hey, it's a relationship between two people. So it's about those kind of how you subtly can influence your culture by using your language carefully.
Cool.
All right. It feels like the questions have died down, which is great, because then we will continue with our lovely Caitlin. What do I do here? Hopefully it works. And otherwise we will share that in another way, I'm sure.
Okay, hello.
Hi, my name is Caitlin DeVos, and I am a volunteer with the American Cancer Society and our American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. And currently, I volunteer in a variety of ways. I am on the Global Relay for Life leadership team as the Student and Young Professional Development Lead. I also am a Global Hero of Hope, and I'm very involved in the Relay for Life program. I help with young professional initiatives, and I'm a high-level volunteer for our advocacy network, working with our lawmakers to make change in public policy. But I didn't start that way. I started as a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who was looking for something to do with my time. And I stopped by a table that said Colleges Against Cancer on it because at the time my mom had colon cancer, and I thought that that might be something I could connect to. And when I stopped at the table, a student and a staff partner started to talk to me, and they said, you should get involved with this. And they asked me to come to a meeting. And that is how my journey began. I went to a Relay for Life meeting. I met the staff, I met the students. It looked like something fun. It looked like something meaningful. And I stayed. They asked me to do a committee role. I said yes. They asked me to go to a training. I said yes. And all of a sudden, things spiraled from there. And it was just people asking me. It was just a staff partner saying, hey, I think you would be great at this. This project looks interesting. Are you interested in that? What do you want to do? How can we make this a win-win for both the organization and for you? And that is how I became the high-level volunteer I am today, having an impact with the American Cancer Society and with supporting some of our global partners as well. It's just about a staff seeing something in you, seeing a little bit of a spark, and then taking that spark and igniting it. And I am so grateful to the staff partners who have helped me to do that. There are so many coming to my mind right now in my brain because it's been a variety of staff over the years. And I'm really grateful that the American Cancer Society has prioritized a volunteer-led, staff-supported movement and has really done a great job of saying, volunteers, you can do this. And we just need to give you the support to make that happen. So I know that there are people around the world who could do as much as a volunteer as me, and they're just waiting to be asked. They're just waiting for someone to believe in them. And I know that by getting more volunteers involved, that we can do even more together in the fight against cancer.
Finally, I hope we didn't really ask you about, hey, how are you going to implement this? Because we know there is quite a few people on this call, so it's a bit hard to manage that interaction. But hopefully you picked up a few things that you think, hey, this is something that we haven't really done in our organization, but it would be interesting to see if we can make a start with that. We definitely were very inspired just by feeling and experiencing that culture. Again, the conference was not telling you how to do these things. We were just there and experienced what the volunteers went through, and we just noticed, it's like, oh my God, do you see this? Have you seen that? Do you know how they do this? And all that sort of stuff. We started looking at it as a, this is systematic, this is not by chance. So that's probably our key message.
Yes.
All right. Again, thank you all for joining. It was a pleasure to have such a great turnout. We really appreciate that. Keep sending Michelle some emails and further questions if you have them. And then we were happy to follow up on them in another way as well.
Wonderful.
So
have a great afternoon.
Keep up the good work.